Daniel Carver had learned to tell time by the sound of his own exhaustion. At 6 in the morning, it was a dull ache behind his eyes. By noon, it was a weight pressing on his shoulders like a sandbag he couldn't set down. By midnight, when he finally sat on the edge of his bed with his shoes still on, it was something closer to grief. Though he had stopped calling it that a long time ago. Grief was for people who had time to feel things. Daniel had 3 children, and a job that started before, the son in a house that never quite stayed clean no matter how many hours he stole from sleep to fight it. His wife Emily had died 2 years earlier on a Tuesday, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and wilting flowers, the kind of death that comes slow enough to steal your hope in installments. Daniel remembered holding her hand and promising her, in a whisper so the children wouldn't hear, that he would keep them together. Keep them safe, keep them loved the way she would have loved them. He had kept that promise every single day since, even when it cost him almost everything he had left. Now it was late October, and his youngest 3-year-old Sam had spiked a fever that would not break. Daniel packed the other 2 into the car without argument, though 7-year-old Lily protested that she was in the middle of a very important dream, and 5-year-old Theo simply refused to open his eyes at all, going limp like a sack of flour, so Daniel had to carry him out to the car still wrapped in his blanket. It was 11 at night. The clinic was a 20-minute drive, and Daniel spent it gripping the wheel with white knuckles, glancing every few seconds at Sam's flushed little face in the rearview mirror. The waiting room of the urgent care clinic was nearly empty, lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes that made everything look pale and unwell. Daniel sat in a plastic chair with Sam burning against his chest. Theo slumped against his left side. Lily curled into his right, already asleep again despite her earlier complaints. He didn't move. He didn't dare wake any of them. He just sat there, feeling the particular loneliness of being the only adult awake in a room full of people who needed him, with no one behind him to lean back into. That was when Claire Bennett came around, the corner with a clipboard in one hand, and stopped mid-step. She had seen a lot of tired parents in her 6 years as a nurse. Tired was the default condition of every guardian who walked through those doors after dark. But there was something different about the way this man sat so still, so careful, like he was afraid that if he moved even an inch, the whole fragile architecture of his children's sleep would come crashing down. She noticed the fraying cuffs of his sweater. She noticed that his own eyes were rimmed red, not from crying, she guessed, but from simply not sleeping in longer than he could probably remember. She crouched down in front of him instead of calling his name across the room. "Hey," she said softly. "I've got you. Let's get your little one looked at." Daniel blinked like he was surfacing from underwater. "Sorry, he's got a fever. Started around 6, I thought it would break on its own, but it just kept climbing." "You don't have to apologize for taking care of your kid," Claire said, already reaching for Sam's wrist to check his pulse. Her voice pitched low so as not to wake the other 2. "Let's see what's going on with this guy." She examined Sam right there in the waiting room chairs at first, unwilling to make Daniel juggle 3 children through a hallway if she could help it. When she determined he needed a proper room, she found a wheelchair for Theo, who was too deeply asleep to walk, and personally carried Lily herself so that Daniel wouldn't have to make 3 trips. It was such a small thing. It was the kind of thing nobody would have blamed her for not doing. But Daniel felt something in his chest loosen slightly, some knot he had been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. In the exam room, Claire worked efficiently but never rushed. She spoke to Sam in a gentle sing-song even though he was too sick and sleepy to really respond, and she spoke to Daniel like he was a person and not just a logistics problem to be processed. She asked about Sam's fever pattern, whether he'd been eating, whether the other 2 had shown any symptoms. And somewhere in the middle of it, almost as an aside, she asked, "Is it just you tonight?" Daniel hesitated. It was a simple question, but simple questions had a way of catching on the jagged edges of his life. "It's just me every night," he said finally. "Their mom passed a couple years back." Claire's hands paused for half a second over Sam's chart before she continued writing. "I'm sorry," she said, and it didn't sound like the reflexive sympathy people usually offered, the kind that expected nothing more than a nod in return. It sounded like she meant it, like she was actually picturing what that meant. The mathematics of one person trying to be 2. "We manage," Daniel said. which was the sentence he had trained himself to say instead of the truth, which was that some nights he sat in his car in the driveway for 10 extra minutes before going inside, gathering whatever strength was left at the bottom of himself. Claire didn't push. She finished the examination, diagnosed a stubborn ear infection that had spiked Sam's fever, wrote a prescription, and walked Daniel through dosing instructions twice patiently. Without a hint of the irritation some staff showed toward parents who needed things repeated. When she was done, instead of simply sending them on their way, she knelt down to Sam's level one more time, brushed his hair back from his damp forehead, and told him he was very brave. Daniel watched her do this and felt something shift in his understanding of the night. He had walked in expecting the ordinary transaction of illness and treatment. He hadn't expected to be seen. As she walked them out to the car, balancing Lily against her hip because the little girl had woken up just enough to demand it, Claire made an offhand comment about how she remembered his face because he'd been in a few months back with the same 3 kids, some minor scrape on Theo's knee. "You always come alone," she said. "I noticed." "There's no one else to come with," Daniel admitted more honestly than he meant to. The exhaustion had worn down his usual careful walls. "It's just us. It's been just us for a while." Claire looked at him for a long moment in the parking lot lighting, the kind of look that wasn't pity, which he had learned to recognize and resent, but something closer to respect. "That's a lot to carry alone," she said simply. "You're doing a good job, though. I can tell. Kids like this settled, this loved, that doesn't happen by accident." Daniel didn't know what to say to that. Nobody had told him he was doing a good job in longer than he could remember. Nobody had told him anything except what he still needed to do, what bills were due, what forms needed signing, what his children needed next. He thanked her, buckled his kids in, and drove home with something unfamiliar sitting in his chest, something almost like hope, though he was too tired and too wary to name it that yet. He didn't expect to see her again outside of the clinic. But 2 weeks later, Sam needed a follow-up appointment, and it was Claire again at the desk. And this time she remembered his name without checking the chart. "Daniel, right? And how's my brave patient?" "Good as new," Daniel said, and found himself smiling for what felt like the first time in weeks. They fell into an easy rhythm over the following month, the kind that only forms between 2 people who recognize exhaustion in each other and choose kindness anyway. Claire started remembering things: that Lily hated the smell of the hand sanitizer in room 2, that Theo was terrified of the blood pressure cuff, that Daniel took his coffee black because he didn't have time to fuss over cream. Small things. The kind of things you only notice if you're paying attention. And Daniel wasn't used to anyone paying attention to him specifically, only to the needs radiating outward from him toward his children. One evening, Claire found him in the clinic parking lot after her shift, sitting in his car but not driving away, just resting his head against the seat with his eyes closed. She knocked gently on his window. He startled awake, apologetic, explaining he'd just needed a minute before driving. "You look like you're running on empty," she said, not unkindly. "I am," Daniel admitted, too tired to perform anything else. "I don't know how to not be. There's no room for it." Claire leaned against his car door and, without asking permission, without making it a big gesture, simply said, "Let me bring dinner by tomorrow. Nothing complicated. Just so you don't have to cook for one night." Daniel wanted to refuse out of some old instinct toward self-sufficiency, toward not being a burden, toward proving he could do this alone the way he'd promised Emily he would. But something in him, some worn-down part that had been holding the line for 2 straight years, simply didn't have the strength to say no to kindness anymore. She came the next evening with a casserole dish and stayed only 20 minutes. Not long enough to feel like an imposition. Long enough for Lily to show her a drawing and for Theo to demonstrate, with great ceremony, his ability to do 7 jumping jacks in a row. Daniel watched his children laugh in a way he hadn't seen in longer. Then he wanted to admit, and he understood, watching Claire kneel down to properly admire Theo's jumping jacks, that this wasn't pity work. This was a person who simply showed up, consistently without being asked twice. It became a pattern. Not overnight, not dramatic, just steady. Claire showing up with small kindnesses that cost her nothing extravagant, but meant everything to a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be helped. Instead of only helping, Daniel started calling her when Sam had a rash he wasn't sure about. Not because he needed a nurse, specifically, but because he wanted her voice on the other end of the line. She started staying later some evenings, past the point where casserole dishes needed returning, past the point where either of them could pretend this was only about the kids. It was Lily, in her uncomplicated 7-year-old way, who finally said what neither adult had allowed themselves to say aloud. One night, watching Claire help Theo with a puzzle at the kitchen table while Daniel made dinner, Lily tugged at Claire's sleeve and asked, with total sincerity, "Are you going to stay forever now?" Claire went still. Daniel at the stove went still too, listening. "I don't know, sweetheart," Claire said carefully. "That's not really up to me." "Is it up to Daddy?" "I suppose it is," Claire said, glancing toward Daniel, who had turned around now, spatula still in hand, looking at her the way a man looks when he has spent 2 years convincing himself he wasn't allowed to want anything for himself again. Later that night, after the kids were down, Daniel walked Claire to her car. The autumn air had turned cold enough to fog their breath, and neither of them moved to end the conversation quickly, the way they usually did. "I need to say something," Daniel said, and his voice shook slightly. The exhaustion of 2 years cracking open into something rawer than tiredness. "I made a promise to my wife that I'd keep our kids together and keep them loved, and I've spent 2 years thinking that promise meant I wasn't allowed to want anything else, like loving someone new would be breaking it." "Daniel, but I don't think that's true anymore," he continued. "I think she'd want them to have more than just a father running on fumes. I think she'd want them to have what you've been giving them without even trying." "What you've been giving me," he exhaled, the words finally out after weeks of circling them. "I don't know how to do this. I haven't done this in years. But I know that when you're here, the house feels less like something I'm barely holding together and more like something that could actually be whole again." Claire reached for his hand, cold fingers finding his in the dark. "For what it's worth," she said, "I wasn't planning on falling. For a single dad with 3 kids and an impossible schedule. Everyone always says nobody signs up for that, but I think they just haven't met the right family. Ordinary tiredness is a simple transaction," Daniel said quietly, almost to himself, an old thought he'd carried for months without saying aloud. "You spend energy, you rest, and it evens out eventually. But this kind of tired, the kind I've had for 2 years, it doesn't work like that. There's no resting it away. I thought it would just be permanent." He looked at her, really looked, in the porch light spilling faintly across the driveway. "You're the first thing that's made it feel like it might not have to be." They stood there a long moment, 2 tired people who had found, almost by accident, that showing up for each other was its own kind of rest. Inside, through the window, the soft glow of a nightlight marked the room where 3 children slept peacefully, unaware that their family, quietly and without fanfare, had just become a little less alone. Months later, on a bright Saturday afternoon, Daniel and Claire walked through the neighborhood park with all 3 kids. Running ahead of them, Lily instructing Theo on the proper technique for chasing pigeons, Sam toddling determinedly behind on legs that had grown steadier and stronger since that fevered night in the clinic. Claire's hand found Daniel's the way it always did now, without either of them thinking twice about it. He glanced at her, at the ordinary miracle of a Saturday with nowhere he needed to be and no exhaustion, pressing on his chest, and thought that Emily had been right to make him promise to keep their children loved. She just hadn't known, and neither had he, that keeping that promise would eventually mean learning to let someone else help him carry it. The kids' laughter carried across the grass, bright and unguarded, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel Carver felt entirely peacefully rested.